papers from last time. Brian, yes, that do. Miss Williams. Miss Noriega. Miss Sandra. Tucker Claudius. Cesar Ibarra. Cesar Ibarra. Elizabeth. Marina. Marina Rivera. And Gabriel. Gabriela. Gabriela.
She usually sits there, but
She's not here. Isaac. James. What's that, sir? Victoria. Amira. Gloria. Miss Cardinal. Miss Cardinal. Gloria. Oh, yes, Gloria. Kimberly. Who's mine? Kimberly. Who's mine? Calix. Not here. Darius Simmons. Okay, today we are going to talk about measuring the cost of living. How do we measure the cost of living, or to live here in America? By keeping up with the prices of goods and services that a typical American spends money on. So when they say that it's expensive to live in America, or expensive to live in this city, or cheaper to live in this city, how do they measure that? And that's what we're trying to do here, measuring the cost of living in America.
what chapter is this?
This is chapter 11. Last week we covered chapter 10.
Yeah.
And what did we measure in chapter 10? We measured something in chapter 10. What was that? We measured the nation's income. We measured gross domestic product. And now we're going to go down to the family level and measure the cost of living in America. Everybody sign this. If you don't sign it, you're absent. So better make sure you sign it. Now, when we say, what is it that a typical American spend money on? This is what we call a typical basket of goods and services. And when we say a typical consumer, who is a typical consumer in America?
Us. Right?
Okay, yeah, us. Who? Define us. Who are we?
Citizens.
Who is a typical citizen in America? A middle class urban dweller. Somebody who is in the middle class, not the super rich, and not the very poor. A typical American is a middle class family person who lives in an urban center in America. So when they talk of a typical consumer in America, you know who you are and you can define yourself. Now, what does a typical consumer spend money on? Housing takes the largest chunk of our money. Of every dollar we spend, 42.2% goes into housing. Whether you rent or you pay mortgage, that takes 42% of your income. Followed by transportation. You're not surprised, are you? Surprised. Transportation. Without that car, you probably wouldn't function very well. Many families would not function without some means of transportation. So transportation takes a large chunk of our income, 16.7%, and that is followed by food and beverage. So three things: food and beverage, transportation, and housing takes the lion's share of the typical American's income. The rest include medical care, of course, 8.7%. Education, that's what you're doing here, 6.5%. Communication, recreation, and the rest. But the large chunk of a typical American's income goes into housing, transportation, food and beverage, and medical care. So the question is, how do we measure that? How do we keep up with that? Because we're measuring these, what makes America's economy tick. We measured national income last week. What is it that we produce in America? And how do we adjust it for inflation? So we distinguish between nominal GDP and real GDP. Okay? And today we're going to measure the cost of living. Now, measuring the cost of living means we have to define certain things. Right? Measuring the cost of living, there is something that you will hear a lot in the news media. It is called Consumer Price Index. Consumer Price Index. Define Consumer Price Index. Consumer, find the definition for me.
It says measure.
Okay. Somebody say it's measure.
Of the overall cost of goods.
Measure of the overall cost of
Goods and services
goods and services
bought by a typical consumer.
bought by a typical consumer. You give me that answer, I will give you 2 points. Thank you. Stay awake. Okay? Stay awake. Work with me. I want you to get these answers yourself. My role is not to pour knowledge into your head. My role is to guide you to where the knowledge is so that you acquire that knowledge. The days when the professor was the sage in stage are gone. The role of the professor today is the guide on the side. There used to be time when professors used to come in and lecture for 30 minutes and the students take knowledge. That means I pour knowledge into your brain and you absorb it. That paradigm of education is gone. Especially after going through 1.5 years of this pandemic. A lot of you did education by yourself. So the role of a professor is radically changed. A guide on the side. I guide you where you find the knowledge and you learn it by yourself. So thank you for working with me. We're going to calculate something called consumer Price Index, or in short, CPI. And it is defined as the measure of the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical American. There are steps to calculating consumer price index. Now that we have defined it, let us calculate it. How to calculate CPI. What is our goal? Measuring the cost of living in America. How do we do it? The first thing that we measure is what is called consumer price index. It is a price index. In chapter 10, we learned of another price index. What was that price index called back in chapter 10? What did we call that price index? In chapter 10, we learned of a price index. You're close, you're coming close.
Domestic product.
That was not a price index. That is the overall goods and services produced in America. What we produce in America, we call it gross domestic product. And remember, you distinguished between gross domestic product and gross national product. What is gross domestic product? Made in America. What is gross national product? Made by Americans. So if it is made in America, whether it is made by Americans or made by foreigners in America, it is part of America's gross domestic product. If it is made by Americans, whether it is made by Americans in America or made by Americans overseas, it is part of America's gross national product. It is absolutely necessary that we distinguish between gross domestic product and gross national product. What was the price index that we learned in chapter 10? How do we measure the level of prices in America? It was probably one of the last things you calculated. You've got to find it. I'm not going to give it to you.
Is it domestic output?
No.
GDP deflator.
What was that?
GDP deflator.
GDP deflator. How do you define GDP deflator? Somebody define it for me. You have to bring it in the forefront of your brain before we can talk about consumer price index, because we are going to study them side by side.
Oh, you're asking for the definition?
Yeah, what's the definition of GDP deflator?
A measure of the price level relative to the level of prices in the base.
Now you know. Keep that definition in mind. Now you just defined consumer price index. What was consumer price index? Now you know. A measure of the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical consumer. Now you can define who is a typical consumer. When we say a typical consumer, it's not Jeff Bezos, is it? Jeff Bezos is not a typical consumer in America. A middle class family living somewhere in the urban center. Not in rural center, urban center. Not the super rich or the super poor, but the middle class. That's the typical American. Okay. How do we calculate the CPI? There are 5 steps involved. The first step is what?
Fix the basket.
Fix the basket. Thank you. Somebody is out there listening. Number 1, fix the basket. What do we mean by fixing the basket? What does that really mean when we say fix the basket? Go to Walmart and find a typical consumer and look at what he's putting or she is putting in that shopping basket. Did she put some housing there, some transportation, some education, some health care? What is it that a typical American put in that basket, that shopping basket? Think of it as a shopping basket. So we fix the basket, we find what is in that basket, the list of goods and services in that basket. So, in our example, we're going to say the basket. Your book gives an example of a basket, and we're going to simplify it. It's not millions of things that you saw in that pie chart. We're going to use an economic model. Economists use very oversimplified models so that we understand it. Okay? It looks silly, but it helps make the point. It is simply impossible to add millions of goods and services out there. For our purposes, for the classroom, what is in this basket? In your book says we are producing what? Our economy is producing 2 goods. And what are these 2 goods? 4 hot dogs, if you look at your books, hot dogs. And we are also producing 2 hamburgers. So, number 1, in the first step in calculating consumer price index, fix the basket. And in our very simplified basket, in this our simplified hypothetical economy, we are producing hamburgers and hot dogs. 4 of them hot dogs and 2 of them hamburgers. What is the next step that you need to do while you're out there in Walmart checking on consumers shopping? What do you do?
Find the prices.
Find the prices. Once you have seen what is in the shopper's basket, go around the aisles. What is hot dog costing? And what is hamburgers costing? So find the prices. And so and then you find the prices for, you got to trace it. It's not a one-day thing that you're doing. You're doing it 1 year, and the next year, and the next year. You're keeping up with the changes in the cost of living. So you're going to find the prices for all the years you're studying. So here, if we say that we're going to try to find the price of hot dogs. And we're going to try to find the price of hamburgers. We have fixed the basket. Now we're going to find what was the price of hot dogs in 2019, 2020, 2021. These are the three years that we worked with last week. And let us use the same prices. Hot dog was costing $1 in 2019, $2 in 2020, $3 in 2021. Price of hot dogs. And hamburgers was costing, somebody help me, what was the price of hamburgers? In 19, I think it was $2. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4, thank you. The price of hamburgers was $2, $3, and $4 respectively. So we can make a nice little chart here. So we just did number 2. We did number 1 and 2. Number 1, fix the basket. Number 2, go around and find the prices of those items year after year after year. Okay? So what is number 3? What was the 3rd step in calculating the CPI? Compute the basket basket cost. Very important. So we fixed the basket, we found the prices, now we want to compute the basket cost. And in, okay, somebody will give me that list of that roll, the class roll, where is it? I'm going to call you by your names. I'd like to do that. Thank you very much. Okay, Ms. Cardenas, we're going to do number 3, compute the basket cost. And we're going to do that here. In 2019, 2020, and 2021. The cost of the basket in 2019 was something plus something is equal to, Ms. Cardenas. What do I put in this parenthesis?
4 times 1.
4 times 1
And 2 by 2.
and 2 by 2 for a total of what?
8.
For a total of 8. You just calculated the cost of the basket in 2019. And in 2020, we're going to go to John. John, what do I put here? And added with, because we're only producing 2 things, and what number do we come up with here? John is in the room, I suppose.
I guess put a 2 right there.
What do I put? Something times something in here. What do I put in there?
2 times,
John, you better settle down and find it because I'm not moving. I'm going to wait. You can.
see the other one?
Yeah, I'm moving. I can move. And yes, you can make a phone call. What did Gloria do to get this times this and this times this?
Alright, 2 times 1?
2 times 1,
Yeah.
and here would be
2 times 3.
2 times 3 for a total of what?
8.
For a total of 8. You're allowed to challenge it, you know? You're allowed to challenge, John. What do you say?
The first one's supposed to be 4 times 2.
4 times 2. Is that right?
Yeah.
4 times 2. And the second one is?
Second one's right.
Is right? So this total will be?
14.
14. John, did you agree with
Yeah, I
Ms.
see my
Kilpatrick?
Yeah, I see my mistake.
The whole idea is to learn it. It's all right to make a mistake, but it's not forgivable if you don't learn from that mistake. All right, then I'm going to go to Lisbeth. I'm going to find some numbers here, plus numbers here, which will give me these numbers. What do I put in here?
4 times 3.
4 times
3.
3, and this would be
2 times 4.
2 times 4 for a total of
20.
20. You're allowed to challenge it. Don't let a mistake go in here. I'm counting on you.
It looks right. So.
You look right? Okay. So we did number 1, fix the basket. 4 hamburgers and 2 hot dogs. Oh, well, the other way around. 4 hot dogs and 2 hamburgers. Then we went around the aisle to find what are the prices of these items in the basket. Then we computed the cost. The consumer spent $8 in 2019. The consumer spent $14 in 2020 and $20 in 2021. Now, tell me what do we do next? Number 4. And I'm going to go to Gabriel Hernandez. What do we do number 4 here? Gabriel, I'm
Choose a
waiting.
base year, compute the CPI.
Compute the CPI? Is that what you say? Okay. What do you do before you compute the CPI?
You choose a base year.
Thank you. Choose the base year. You can't do it without choosing the base year. So you choose the base year. Choose the base year and compute. Compute the CPI. And the base year is what? Base year is 2019. By the way, base year can be any of those 3 years. It does not have to be 2019. I know we have used 2019 last week and this week. But you pick a base year, it can be 2019, it can be 2020, and it can be 2021, as long as you pick the base year and keep the prices fixed in that base year. So, that means the next agenda is to compute CPI. So somebody has to give me what is the formula for calculating CPI. CPI in year 2, or no, well, not exactly. Let's just say CPI in a given year is what over what?
Baskets cost in current year over baskets cost in base year.
Baskets cost in current year over baskets cost, same basket, don't change the basket, okay? Same basket, let me write here. Same baskets cost in base year.
Times 100.
Times 100, that is what makes it an index, price index, thank you. That's a very important distinction. 100. Remember when we were calculating the GDP deflator, we multiplied by 100. You got to convert it into a percentage. And here, the formula for calculating consumer price index is cost of the goods in current year divided by the cost of the same basket in the base year multiplied by 100. Okay, so I'm going to go to Ms. Rodriguez Marina. You're going to help me out here. So we're going to help me with CPI in 2019 is equal to and then we're going to have CPI in 2020 is equal to, and then CPI is equal to. Okay, Ms. Rodriguez, what goes here as a numerator?
Cost in the current year.
What is that again?
Cost in the current year.
And what is that?
8,
8?
Yeah.
You're not sure, right? Okay. Ms. Kirkpatrick, is she right? Is that 8? Should that be 8? Darius Simmons, is that 8? Agree, eh?
Yes.
All right, anybody disagree? Okay, and what goes as the, Ms. Rodriguez, what is the denominator?
Still 8, right?
Still 8.
Yeah.
And then when you multiply that by 100, what answer do you get over there?
100? A 100.
100. The consumer price index for the base year is 100. Did you see that last week? What was the consumer price, what was the GDP deflator for the base year last week? 100. The price index in the base year is always 100. That's why we call it the base year, sort of a baseline. That's why you compare everything. Okay. So we know that the base year price index is going to be 100. Then I'm going to go to Darius Simmons. What goes up here for 2020? 14, and what goes here? 8. And what do you come up with here? Put it in your calculator. 175. Very good. Ms. Tucker, what about the last one? What goes here? Victoria?
20.
Ms. Tucker says 20, and what goes as the new denominator?
8.
That's 8. And you multiply that with by 100, what do you get?
250.
250. Anybody can make a correction? Is there any correction here? What was the first step? Fix the basket. What is in the basket? 4 hot dogs, 2 hamburgers. Next step, find the prices. We went along the aisles and found the prices of hot dogs and the price of hamburgers. What was number 3? We computed the cost of these items. If we were checking out, what would we pay the cashier in these years? Number 4, now we use this cost in the basket, plug it into the formula. What does the formula say? Basket's cost in the current year, divide by the basket's cost in the base year times 100. GDP deflator, what was the formula? Nominal GDP divided by real GDP times GDP deflator. GDP is all the goods and services made in America. That's GDP deflator. That's called a GDP deflator. And we are calculating the price index for the entire economy. Consumer price index is a subset of that. Consumers don't buy everything made in America. Okay, there are just certain things that we saw in that pie chart that consumers spend their money on. So that's a subset of what the GDP deflator is. But they seek to measure the same variable, and that's the cost of living or the change in price level within the economy. Okay, now we have gone to number 4. What do we do? What is the next step? Number 5.
Compute the inflation rate.
Now we can compute the inflation. We use the ultimate goal. What was the goal? Measuring the cost of living. How do you measure the cost of living? By computing inflation. The rate of inflation. Prices are going up or prices are going down. Okay? So number 5. Compute the inflation rate. Compute the inflation rate, and we're going to try to squeeze some spot here. inflation rate, Isaac Timms, what is the formula for calculating inflation rate?
CPI this year minus CPI last year over CPI last year times 100.
So let's say CPI this year minus CPI, so let's say this year would be year 2 minus CPI last year would be year 1, divided by what?
CPI last year.
CPI last year, CPI last year, that would be that year 1, and then do you multiply by something?
Yes, 100.
It is a price index. The inflation rate is reported in percentages. So you use the CPI, what we just calculated here, to calculate the inflation rate. Now we can make a judgment as to whether it is expensive to live in America or not. And these numbers differ from one part of the country to the other. It is cheaper to live in Mississippi than to live in New York. This is how they calculate the cost of living over there. Ms. Vasquez, if I'm going to calculate inflation rate, I like using shorthands. So if I say this is equal to inflation rate. Okay, this is a symbol for pi in mathematics, but let's use it now to say it's inflation rate. We like to use funny variables like that. So inflation rate for 2020 is equal to, and inflation rate for 2021 is equal to, and I'm going to ask Ms. Vasquez.
For both of them or just one of them?
Just one, just
Okay.
give me one. In
Um,
other words, what do I do with what? Give me these numbers here.
14 minus 8 over 8
That would be 14 minus 8 over 8
times 100.
times 100,
And I got 75.
and that is 75. And that is a percent. Inflation rate was 75%. And if anybody got lost, this is what she did. Okay, inflation rate for 2020 was equal to CPI in year 20 minus CPI in year 19 divided by CPI in year 19 times 100. If you're trying to figure out where those numbers came from. What was the CPI in year 20?
Other side, other part, the red. Oh, I
Oh,
got it wrong.
oh.
Okay, anyways.
Ms. Vasquez, shall we let her live? Yeah, we'll let her.
I'd say let me die.
No, we'll let her live. All right.
Okay, so then it would be 175.
175. So
Yeah.
here, so we are, this is the CPI, right, ladies and gentlemen, this is CPI. Okay? When you go down here, when we talk of CPI, this is what we were actually trying to figure out. Once we got this, that's the raw material that goes into the calculation of that. So in other words, CPI for 20 would have been 175 divided by CPI for 19 would be 100 divided by
100.
100, and that would be what?
7,500.
No, I don't think so. Are you sure?
Yeah, 175 minus 100.
75. I think we're still going to end up with 75 though. Okay? So this would be 175 minus 100 divided by 100, and that would be 75. Thank you, Ms. Vasquez. Let's go to Mr. Parker Clovis. We're going to try to figure out the inflation rate for 2021.
Okay, so you take CPI from the 2021, which was 250,
So that'll be 250.
minus the CPI from the preceding year, 175.
175.
That's over the CPI from last year as well, so it's 175.
175.
And
Multiply by 100, right?
yes, sir.
What do you get here?
42.9 rounds to 0.9.
And that's you do that, the goal for this chapter is done. Fix the price, find the prices, compute the basket cost, choose the base year, then compute the CPI, then use the CPI to compute inflation. Now we can safely report to the news media that inflation rate went up here in Arlington, Texas, or Fort Worth, Texas, by 42.9%. And it will make a big splash of news. Oh, cost of living is going up, everything is expensive in America and all that stuff. Everybody can make a judgment, but now you know how we calculate these things. Your next quiz is going to be what you do here. You're going to do something exactly like this, and you're going to turn it in. And that will be your quiz. You got homework that I need to pick up, right? Okay. Then your next quiz, which is the quiz 3 or quiz 4, I'm not sure which quiz this is going to be doing exactly something like this. You're going to do exactly something like you did for last week, but now this is a different thing. Okay, now this is calculating cost of living. So that means I think I was recording this for the next class. Let's just stop the whole thing now.